With all this free time, what would you do with it if you're not going to work? That's what we're going to talk about today is one option, beer, homebrewing your own beer. One of the reasons we started this show is we did not want to just talk about the math of financial independence, but we wanted to talk about the other side of it. What do you do once you get there? What do you do to fill all that time you did spend working, and now you have it free and available to do with as you please? Welcome back to another episode of Achieving Minerva. My name is Sal. I noticed we have a new listener from Canada. Welcome, Canada. Everybody else is from the United States. Regardless of where you're listening, we're happy you are listening. So today we're talking about beer, homebrewing beer, craft beer, and the history of it briefly, and just hopefully just a little bit of an idea of what you could spend your time doing instead of working for the man. A little bit of history about beer to begin with before we get into the actual hobby itself. Because beer in itself, craft beer, has become something of a hobby. Just consuming beer and appreciating it as an art form has kind of become a hobby in and of itself. But a little bit of history about craft beer. A lot of people argue that beer is actually to be blamed for the start of civilization way back in Mesopotamia. They have found residue of beer that is estimated to be 13,000 years old in Mesopotamia. If you've watched any sort of documentary about the start of civilization, the start of mankind, anything like that, you will notice that bread and or beer are kind of the cause of what started civilization. Basically, you need wheat for both. If you've ever been on a tour of a craft brewery, it kind of smells like bread. So some people argue it was beer. Some people argue it was bread that made everybody start farming wheat and barley. Who's to say that it wasn't a little bit of both? That 13,000-year-old sample I mentioned earlier is the earliest archaeological evidence of fermentation. So that was found in the Carmel Mountains, which is kind of near Israel, still in the same Mesopotamia-ish area that we are still talking about. The Epic of Gilgamesh, which is basically a similar story to Noah and the flood in Mesopotamian mythology, has the quote, "Fill your belly day and night and make merry," which was advice from one of the deities in that epic story. There's evidence from 7,000 BC in China of a kind of a fermented rice drink. It's different from sake because mold was not used to saccharify the rice, which is kind of another chemical process that is required in order to make the famous Japanese drink sake. When we kind of fast forward into Middle Ages Europe, it's basically just domestic production of beer. You'll go into a little tavern house and have their local ale. Picture your Game of Thrones, your Lord of the Rings, little taverns that they find on their journeys. That's basically what Middle Ages Europe, as far as beer, looks like. Now, the actual product of beer at that time was probably a little different than what you're thinking of today. It wasn't just Budweiser and Bud Light. It had the starch, and it also had fruits and herbs and probably some opium back in the day and honey. But there was no hops, notably. That's kind of the main thing that they didn't have at that time. In 1516, William IV suggested the first food regulation that is still in use. So there were probably some other ones before that, but this is the oldest one that is still in use around the world. And that's that beer has to have water, hops, and barley malt. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. Monasteries around Europe had the first commercial scale operation. And if you talk to a lot of craft beer enthusiasts, the monasterical, the Baptists, or the Trappist ales are some of the most renowned craft beers you can find at some of the niche stores. Some of them go for hundreds of dollars per bottle. A lot of that has to do with some of those monasteries have been perfecting their recipe for thousands of years to date. They're the oldest breweries, technically, and they had kind of the first commercial scale operations, and definitely some of the only commercial operations prior to the Industrial Revolution. So that's kind of the 15, 16, 1700s. And then we get into the Industrial Revolution. We start to see it shift from what you see in Game of Thrones or Lord of the Rings, and you kind of see the bigger operations that we see today. So the Industrial Revolution is basically from like 1750 or so to about 1860. It's kind of when a lot of scholars kind of rope that into. There's debate on the exact dates, but anyway, that is when the domestic scale operations kind of started scaling into more commercial operations. From 1760 to about 1970, so that's still 200 years. Large scale operations occurring. Anheuser-Busch is kind of the most notable, was founded in 1852. Anheuser-Busch has your Budweiser, which also includes your Bud Light and all those products, your Natty Lights, your Busch Lights. Currently, they own Shock Top and Landshark lagers. Anheuser-Busch is famous for their Busch and their Budweiser brand. And that was founded in 1852. And Anheuser-Busch is kind of the premier, at least in America, one of the companies that survived Prohibition, which is kind of what stopped a lot of the American production. Prohibition is the 13-year kind of dark period for alcohol in the United States. And because the United States was even at that time kind of a large economic player, it is kind of a good kind of marking point as far as where the different eras of beer are. In Europe, remember, there wasn't Prohibition, so they were still continuing on. If you talk about beer or bourbon or anything like that in the United States, there's kind of the companies that survived Prohibition and the companies that did not, and then some of the new ones that kind of popped up after Prohibition ended. And so that was from 1920 to 1933. And so Anheuser-Busch is one of the companies that survived Prohibition. If we fast forward into the 1980s, that's where the craft beer in America really kind of starts to take off. Sam Adams is sometimes referred to as the founding father of the craft beer industry in America. And that was founded in 1984. And if we fast forward again to today, there are thousands of local and regional breweries. So that's kind of just like a really brief history of beer. There's a lot more to it, but I didn't want to bore you with the history of beer. We're going to move on to the process. So beer has to contain 4 ingredients at minimum. It has to contain grain, which is barley most of the time. It has to contain water. It has to contain hops. And it has to contain yeast. And if you are a Scotch or a whiskey drinker, you'll notice that except for hops, that's pretty much the recipe for Scotch. So whiskey is essentially a distilled version of beer. And that's a whole nother episode in and of its own if we decide to go that route. Grain, water, hops, and yeast is all that's required to have beer. So the process for making beer is you start with a mash. You take your barley and you basically steep it like a tea for about an hour to an hour and a half, depending on the recipe. And it's got to be steeping usually around 180, 160 degrees Fahrenheit. And what that's doing is it's taking the starch from your grains and it's turning into a simple sugar for the yeast to turn into alcohol. Yeast can't really handle starch because it's too complex. It's 2 sugar molecules combined together. And so what this kind of heating and steeping does, this mash, is it separates them into 2 separate sugar molecules, and that's better for the yeast to work its magic. So after the mash is about an hour to 3 hours, depending on how complicated it all is. And after you do that, you go to what's called the boil. And the boil is where you're going to add in your hops. And if you're really experimenting, it's usually where you're going to add in some of your additives. Right around Christmas time, you're going to add all of your different spices, your nutmeg, your coffee, or something like that. Fall beer, you're probably going to add pumpkin or pumpkin spice or things of that nature. But that's where a lot of people really experiment, is in the boil. And usually the boil is about from an hour to 2 hours, and you're continually adding these hops. Hops are a citrusy plant, Cumulus lupulus, if you're interested in that. But you're basically taking this little bud, and it smells very strong when you take it out of the package. And there's a a million different varieties of hops. Some hops are used for what's called bittering. So like your IPAs are notably bitter. In general, this is just broad strokes, but in general, your darker beers, your porter, your stout, and sometimes even your ambers are not quite as bitter. So there's a little bit less hops and definitely less of those what's called bittering hops. And towards the end of your boil, you're going to add your finishing or your flavor hops. Those come in a bunch of different varieties. But all beer has to contain at least some hops. Once the boil is done, you don't have to be quite as careful about sanitation because before the boil, anything that's in the liquid or in your kettle is going to be boiled, and essentially that's going to sanitize your liquid. But anything after the boil is no longer going to be boiled, so anything after that the liquid is going to touch needs to be meticulously sanitized. You'll notice that brewers are very meticulous about sanitation, and that's because anything can kill the yeast or it can make the beer go bad. So anything after the boil needs to be very sanitary. That way the yeast doesn't mess with the stuff that it's not supposed to. So after the boil, you're going to cool it down as fast as you possibly can. Because what's coming next is the fermentation. You're going to pitch your yeast. You're boiling this liquid at roughly 200 degrees Fahrenheit, and you have to get it down to hopefully like 70 to 80 degrees as fast as you possibly can. Most people will use like an ice bath. Some people will use, what I use is a copper coil that's hooked up to my hose. And so I'll stick that into the pot while it's boiling for the last 10 minutes to sanitize the copper. And it's got two spouts coming up. One's coming in from the hose and one's shooting it out as waste. And so you'll send water from your garden hose into this radiator, and it goes through the boil through the copper pipe. And it takes me usually about 30 minutes to cool it down. That's even including also an ice bath on the outside of the kettle. So once it's cooled down to proper temperature, usually about 70 to 80 degrees Fahrenheit, then you're going to pitch your yeast. And ideally, you're transferring all of this into like a glass carboy that maybe your grandparents might have used to collect change back in the day, or basically what is on a water cooler, but it's hopefully glass and not plastic. So you'll pitch your yeast, and then you'll wait about 2 weeks, usually at least 2 weeks, sometimes more, sometimes less. It kind of depends on what recipe you're following. You'll take a measurement when you pitch the yeast, or right before rather, and that's going to be called your specific gravity, and that's going to tell you how dense the liquid is. At this point, it's called wort. Before you put your yeast in, it's called wort, W-O-R-T. So you'll take that measurement, your specific gravity, you'll put your yeast in, and after about 2 weeks, you're going to take another measurement, and it's going to be your final gravity. The first one was actually your original specific gravity. Now it's your final specific gravity. And the difference basically tells you how much alcohol is in there. The yeast is going to take the sugars that you made during the mash, and it's going to eat the sugars and poop out carbon dioxide and ethanol alcohol, which is what we want. After about 24 hours to 48 hours after you've pitched your yeast, you should be seeing what's called the fermentation head, and you'll see it bubbling and bubbling and bubbling. After it's done fermenting, you're going to age it. You're either going to put it into bottles and let it age for an additional 2 weeks, or you're going to put it into a keg and you're going to carbonate it using forced carbonation. That's definitely the easiest, but it's not where you probably want to start because it requires a little bit more permanent equipment. That's just kind of a general broad stroke how beer gets from not beer to beer, and in your hand and in your belly. There's a lot of variations as far as different equipment that goes on. What I use for the mash is I have an old 10-gallon Gatorade water kit that you see on the side of like tennis courts. And I converted that into a mash tun using a couple videos I found online. And so that's where I use to mash that steep. And so I'll go to a homebrew store, a local homebrew store, get my grains and put them in there and heat my water up. I use like an old Bunsen burner you use for like turkey frying. So I use that outside. It's propane Bunsen burner and a big 10-gallon kettle. Most batches that you make in homebrewing is going to be 5 gallons at the end, but you want your vessels that you're using to actually make the beer to be much larger than 5 gallons. So I have a 10-gallon kettle. So I'll use the kettle to keep heated water and keep dumping that into the mash tun. So I'll keep dumping water periodically into the mash tun to keep that temperature up at around whatever my goal is. And it depends on what grains you're actually using to start out. Barley has so many different varieties and they're roasted differently, but you choose your variety based on what you're trying to make. Whether you're trying to make an IPA or a stout, you're going to have 2 different what's called mash bills. But I keep the kettle boiling or close to it, and so I can keep adding water. And then when I'm done with that, I'm going to do what's called sparge, and I'm going to get all the water that's been steeping and collecting from the mash tun and get it into a different kettle that I'm going to boil in. And basically makes this really sweet water. It tastes kind of like liquid bread. And that's going to go into my kettle that I'm going to use to boil. And you want that to be much larger than 5 gallons because you're going to boil off about probably 1.5 gallons to 2 gallons after an hour or more. So I'll put that into the new kettle, boil it, and add my hops as prescribed on the recipe. And I don't generally make up my own recipes at this point. I'm not quite that good or confident, but there are websites that have a lot of recipes you can find for free. And you can actually get starter kits. So the first probably 5 batches that anybody would recommend you do are what's called an extract kit. And that's basically, instead of using just straight up grain, what's called all grain brewing, you will get this starter pack and it has syrup, which is basically concentrated extract. And that's to make sure that you get some sugar for your yeast to ferment. If you do this on your own with just the grain, it's fairly likely that you won't extract the sugars from the starch correctly. And so having kind of those training wheels of the extract helps ensure that you have at least some sugar to get the yeast moving. But anyway, with the kit or with any recipe you find online, it'll say exactly what mash bill you're supposed to get from your store, how long and at what temperature you're supposed to mash, and then how long your boil is going to be. Usually it's an hour to an hour and a half, sometimes 2 hours for some really specific beers. And within that boil, it'll say at the store you should also buy this, and this variety of hops and in these quantities. On the process part of the recipe, it's going to say you want to boil these hops for the full 60 minutes. You want to boil these hops for only the last 30 minutes, and you want to put these hops in on the last 5 minutes. And it'll say some variation of that. So throughout the hour that it's boiling, you want to make sure that you're adding those hops at the right time, because the boiling is breaking down the acids from those different hops in certain ways to do what they're supposed to do, either flavor or bitter the beer. So once the boil is done, I already mentioned kind of how I cool it off. Immediately, as fast as I can, I put it into an ice bath. The full 10-gallon kettle that it was boiling, I put it into an ice bath, and I run my copper coil cooler through it, and it usually takes me about 30 minutes to get down to 70 or 80 degrees. It's a little bit quicker in the winter time because I do this outside. I don't have a good setup inside, so I do it outside, and the garden hose has pretty cold water in it in the winter, so that helps cool it off a little bit quicker. Take everything from the boil and put it into a glass carboy that has now been sanitized. Remember, now we're past the boil, so everything needs to be very carefully sanitized. I'll put it in the glass carboy, and my yeast starter, which I've started a day ago. Not everybody does that. That's not a requirement, but I'll start the yeast a day or two in advance, and I'll put the yeast in, and I'll put our airlock on. It's a rubber cork that goes into the top of the carboy, and then an airlock, which is just a little liquid so you can see bubbles, and that blocks the beer from the environment so nothing can get into the beer for the yeast to mess up the yeast doing their thing. And then I'll put it into a closet for about 2 weeks or so. I'll check on it every other day or so, and when it stops boiling, or on your recipe it should tell you ballpark how long it should take to ferment. and it'll tell you kind of the ideal gravity measurements to get. And some beers will require an additional fermentation or something like that, but the world is your oyster really in this game. So after the fermentation, if you're bottling, you're going to start what's called the bottling aging solution, which is just another sugar to make your bottles carbonated by the end of it. And aging usually takes about another 2 weeks or more. But I've recently moved into kegging, which is way easier. You take everything that you took out of your fermentation vessel, and you put it into the keg, and then you force carbonate it with an external CO2 tank, and then you hook it up to your kegerator or something like that, and then you'll basically be serving yourself what you would get at a bar on tap. And so that's way easier. And there's a lot of variations on equipment. There are definitely kits where you can get full automated temperatures with heating and temperature gauges all over the place. They're a couple $1,000s or so. Now, styles. This is pertinent even if you're not into actually making your beer. This is pertinent information for just if you want to try getting into craft beer. So basically, you kind of have these ranges. So IPAs and pale ales are like all the rage right now. I'm not really a big hop head, but I do enjoy the occasional one. So IPAs and pale ales are known because they are just loaded with hops. They've now become kind of just clown cars for hops, but they were originally hopped to be preservatives. So India Pale Ale comes from the East India Trading Company, and they had to figure out a way for the beer to last from Europe, where it started, to all their colonies where they were trying to get the beer to the people that were buying it and consuming it elsewhere. So the hops were used to preserve. So they just hopped the crap out of it, and it made it really bitter. Nowadays, people like it. It's just people love the hoppy IPAs. I'm not a big fan, but to each their own. Then you have your wheats, your Hefeweizens. This is like your Blue Moon, pretty middle-of-the-road beers. Your blondes kind of also are pretty adjacent to these kinds of beers, but your Blue Moons and things like that. Hefeweizens from Germany are very similar. They're mostly found in like summer. They're good summer beers. Reds are starting to get into a little bit darker. Reds come in a different, nice little mix of strong or light. And then you got your ambers and your browns, which are a little bit darker than your reds, and they're starting to get less bitter most of the time. And then you have your porters and your stouts. Porter is basically an offshoot of stout, and there's all sorts of different offshoots. There's Kolsch, there's Pilsners that are all kind of offshoots of these similar things. If you find a spectrum of beer styles online, you can find hundreds. And basically, the most ridiculous, the name, like Double Imperial IPA, Double Imperial Stout, basically the most ridiculous, the name, just be prepared for just being slapped in the face with the flavor. Your stouts and your porters are usually dark, sweet. They have coffee, chocolate notes, things of that nature. And all those things that I've mentioned are ales, and that basically means that they are fermented in a ambient room temperature of about 60 to 70-ish degrees Fahrenheit. Your lagers are basically what all your light beers are. Your Bud Light, your Budweiser, your Miller Lite, all those, your Corona is a lager, all of those kind of islandy Mexican beers, those are all lagers, and those were fermented cold. Those were fermented probably at like 40 degrees or so, 30 or 40 degrees Fahrenheit. And so that's kind of the main difference of those. But lagers are, because of Bud Light and all your kind of national beers, lagers are the most popular style of beer in the world. If you enjoyed all that and you really want to get into home brewing or get into craft beer, some recommended reading is How to Brew by John Palmer. Last I checked, there's a free PDF circulating on the web, a legal free copy of it. So I definitely recommend that. He really breaks down the chemistry of beer and the process of it. Getting started with like equipment is going to be probably about $200 to $300 if you're going to start with a reasonable beginner's kit without going for the 1,000 all automatic. But as a hobby, it's actually kind of sustainable once you get started. The kits of 5 gallons for like a 5-gallon recipe kit is anywhere from like $30 to $70. And 5 gallons, if you get perfect yield, is going to get you between 40 to 50 12-ounce beers. So you're really looking at about $1 to $2. Maybe a more expensive one would be $3 per beer. So it's actually kind of economical once you get there. But like anything else, there's a lot of upfront costs. And the world is your oyster. You know, every Dr. Pepper, every Coca-Cola tastes more or less the same, unless you're at McDonald's where they do something to it special. But every beer that I've ever tasted is different. But it's all beer because it has those 4 things: grain, water, hops, and yeast. Everything else, you get to decide what goes in there. There are just thousands and millions of different beers out there in the world. And that's one of the things that I really like about it. A whole day of brewing takes about 5 hours or so. And then, of course, there's weeks of waiting and patience to actually craft the final product. That's one of the things that I do with my time, with my extra third of a year in days that I have that a lot of people don't. And it's something that you could consider dabbling in if you're thinking about retiring and you're going to have a bunch of time to try different things. If you enjoyed something like this, I hope to do some more of these kind of hobby-focused episodes and a little bit less money-focused. Please let me know what you'd like to hear about. I have a lot of other hobbies that I like to do. I also have a blog at achievingminerva.com. Please feel free to go over there and read that. I'm on Twitter at MinervaFire. And we will see you next time.